thank you all for coming today. I'm Margaret Copey. I am the convener of the League of Women Voters of Lexington, and I welcome you all to today is our fifth of our first Friday series, and today's topic, Trump Tariffs, is a primer with Paul Andrus, who's standing right here. He's the Robert G. Ory Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Do you want me to read all of this?
No.
It was in the notice, so you all can go back and read that yourself. We've organized these forums for probably over 20 years now to promote awareness and understanding of public policy issues. LexMedia is recording the event today for the later showing, usually in a few days. It goes up on the LexMedia site. There will be time for questions and answers after the program. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to the principles of self-government established in the Constitution of the United States. The League works to promote political responsibility through informed and active participation of citizens in government. And I just want to remind you of the League slogan that democracy is not a spectator sport, which is widely attributed to Lottie Sharfman, who was from Lexington, and who was president of the Lexington League, president of the State League, and who was heading the drive in 1970 to reduce the size of the legislature from 260 to the current 140, is it? Yeah, or 180, whatever it is, 160. She was leading that. Did you know her? Judy, I see you shaking your head, yeah. And tragically, they were just on the edge of getting it through, and she dropped dead. She had a serious underlying health issue, I understand. She was 42 when she died.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but eventually that did happen. The legislature did get reduced, which it needed to be. It was way too big. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out.
Which legislature?
The state House of Representatives. So yeah, it was like 160 members or something, or 260 members. Everybody you knew was a state rep. Okay, Paul, are you ready to start?
I am. So thanks for the invitation, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here. I live in Belmont, not too far, so I've been around here many times, but never inside this building. And I was asked to talk about Trump tariffs a few weeks ago. Obviously, it's an even more timely topic today, but one that it's a bit hard to speak about in concrete terms because these Trump tariffs are changing by the hour almost. Okay, so what I thought I would do, and I honestly did not know exactly how to approach the talk. What I thought I would do is I would speak for about half an hour and just speak about some basic concepts. I understand some of you have an econ training, so obviously what I'm going to say might be obvious, but I don't want to take for granted that everybody knows what a tariff is, or why might you be excited about a tariff, or why might you be concerned about a tariff. So I want to go over the basics of that. I will get into Trump tariffs towards the end at a high level, but I'm not in a hurry, so I'm happy to stick around and answer more specific questions and maybe be a bit more adventurous in my answers. I'm going to approach that for the time being in a basic manner. This is a nonpartisan organization, so I'm going to approach it in what I think is a nonpartisan way. Okay, but if you push me a bit later, my true colors might start showing up. Okay? So I've organized the talk into 8 questions that I'm going to try to provide some answers to. Okay? So what are these 8 questions? The first one is, what are we talking about? What is an import tariff exactly? How does an economist define an import tariff? Then you might ask yourself, how high are these tariffs? And how high might they be in recent years relative to the past? How unique this episode is. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that. Then I'm going to get to a hot topic, which is who pays a tariff, right? So it seems like something as basic as who pays a tariff, there's a debate about it. How can that be? When I buy a house, I pay the house. There's no doubt of who's paying. So why do we debate about who pays a tariff? Then I'm going to go and start outlining the basic effects of a tariff. How does an economist think about why a country, when a country sets up, imposes a tariff, what does that do to the economy? How does that affect different people in an economy? That's going to be in terms of applying economic theory, of what economic theory tells us about how it's going to impact different people in society. And then I'm going to ask the question of, given this and maybe political forces, how are tariffs actually determined? What's behind that process? What do politicians have in mind when they set tariffs? Do they have these things in mind? Might they have other things in mind? Then I'm going to talk about the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And I do so because, something that my students often are wondering, and maybe you've wondered about this too, is, if you asked me 10 years ago, I thought there was an organization, the WTO, that was raining on countries and in their ability to kind of raise tariffs. We set this up to kind of promote free trade. So how does the WTO actually try to constrain tariffs? And more importantly, why has it failed? Why do we have a trade war if there's an international organization that should be preventing this? Okay, Trump. Okay, so I am going to get to Trump. I'm going to, with this background, I'm going to try to figure out or sort of go over potential reasons why Trump won the first administration imposed tariffs, and what were those tariffs, and what might he have had in mind. And then I'm going to talk about the current situation. Trump 2, new wave of tariffs. Is this more of the same? Are they different? How are they different? And if they're different, why are they different? Okay? And then what I'm not going to answer here is going back at what are the economic effects. That's probably what's on your mind. Okay, say this happens, it goes through. What is going to happen? We can talk about that later. But I'm reluctant to engage in that because I don't know what these things are going to look like. We don't know. I mean, if you have a phone, you probably will be more informed than I am by the end of the talk, because something will have changed. Okay? That's the plan. If you like it, stay. If not, I have nothing else. So. Okay, so what is an import tariff? It's a very simple thing to define. An import tariff is a tax. Okay? It is really a tax. President Trump uses the word tariff as a verb. I'm going to tariff this country. Probably use the word tariff because he doesn't want to say tax. That's a bad word. But it is a tax. It's just a peculiar tax, like a sales tax, but it's a tax that is set on goods that are coming from another country. In the U.S. case, a U.S. import tariff is a tax that applies to goods that are coming from foreign countries. Okay, so if I'm buying a car from Canada, I'm going to pay the price of the car, but I might have to pay a percentage of that price and pay it to U.S. Customs that goes into U.S. government coffers. Okay, so that's very simple. I think everybody knows that it's an import tax. It's a tax on imports. How high have been these tariffs? Or how high are they? Let me first take a global perspective. So this is a graph from a paper I wrote a while back, plotting some sort of average. Obviously, tariffs might vary across different goods, for cars, for electronics, for this and that. You can take an average of those tariffs and look at what the average tariff that countries set on other countries have been over the last 75 years. Okay? And what you observe is that in the post-World War period, it's a period of ever declining average tariffs. And very often we show this graph to say that, to kind of praise the power of the GATT, then WTO, as an international organization that, unlike other global problems like climate change, this is an organization that actually effectively managed to solve what we economists think is a problem, which is the problem of protection, and reduced average tariffs from levels of well over 15% to levels much lower than that. If I look at the US pre-Trump, those averages were even lower. Okay? If I go December 2017, the average US tariff was below 2%. Okay? So the US was essentially setting tariffs on very few goods, and for those goods, the tariffs were relatively low. Trump comes in, and I'll come back to this Trump 1 tariffs, starts putting tariffs on some goods, solar panels, washing machines, steel, aluminum, so on and so forth. And as a result, the average tariff in the US went up over that period. But notice that even at the end of the war, it's about 5-6%. Okay? So it's not anywhere near tariff levels that we had after World War II. To put it, even this in more perspective, some of you might be wondering, well, what if you go before 1950? Okay, and this is the U.S. average tariffs going back to the late 19th century, and you see that from historical standards, current tariff levels are very, very low. Okay, Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the interwar period shot up U.S. tariff rates to 50-60%. So again, why do I put this up? I think it's a bit provocative, but saying, look, when we're talking about setting very high tariff rates, this is not something that hasn't happened in the past. This is something that has happened. It's possible and has happened. The fact that it happened during the Great Depression should give you some pause, okay? But it is something that has happened, and many folks see some parallels of the world situation in the late 20s and 30s to the current situation. And this is another aspect that makes that connection tangible. If there are questions along the way, I'm happy to take questions. Again, I'll leave time for the Q&A at the end. But I don't want, if there's things that are not clear, feel free to jump in. Who pays a tariff? Okay? Seemingly a very simple thing to answer, because we know that it is domestic businesses that pay, the domestic businesses that are importing goods into the U.S., they receive the goods in the U.S., they pay the tariffs. So from the point of view of who actually pays the tariff, it is very clear it's the U.S. importers. Any Democrat that goes in the press, that's what they would say. Americans pay the tariff. Are they right? Not clear. Because in economics, what we care about is who is effectively paying the tariff. It is one thing to actually pay the tariff. The other one is to, think about what the tariff might do to the price of that transaction. This is not just specific of tariffs. This is a broader concept of economics, which is the concept of tax incidence. If I have a transaction, I buy a house, and they put a tax of 10%, does that mean that the buyer is going to pay 10% more? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there might be other buyers that are willing to, pay. Let me step back. So, it's a 10% tax on. I should have prepared this. If there's a 10% tax on the house, is the buyer going to pay 10% more? No, maybe they're not going to be willing to buy the house. So I'm going to have to lower the before tax price so that they go ahead with that. And maybe at the end of the day, we're going to split the tax. That's going to be an issue of who is willing to pay more or less, how much the demand falls as the price goes up, how much the supply adjusts to a higher or lower price. Demand and supply elasticities, that's a technical term, are going to actually end up governing who effectively pays the tariff. Okay, in more plain words, you can put a 10% tax on the car, but if the Canadian exporter lowers the price by 10%, I'm not paying the tax. Okay, so in principle, the idea that the foreigners pay the tax, it is a theoretical possibility, as is the possibility that we entirely pay the tariff because the foreign producers is not willing to reduce the price. Okay? So ultimately, in economics, we'd say this is an empirical question. Okay? It depends. So we always get criticized for going to the press and saying, what is it? It depends. Nobody likes it depends. But it does depend. Okay? So we cannot give a yes or no answer. Okay? What are the economic effects of tariffs? Okay, so the impact effect is typically, unless the foreigners fully pay the tariff, which is almost never the case, the impact is going to be the prices are going to go up. Maybe the car price is not going to go up by 10%, but it's going to go up by 5%, or maybe 2%, but it's going up. So if the domestic price goes up, that means consumers, the buyers of those goods, are not going to be happy. That's going to reflect higher prices, inflation, whatever it may be. We're going to have less disposable income for other goods. So the effect on what we call consumer welfare, consumer surplus, is a negative. Who likes a tariff? The producers of the good, the local producers of that good. So car producers in the US, in principle, and I'll get to that, it's a bit more subtle, but you know, a tariff on imports of goods, of cars, might be good for them because it raises the price of cars. And because when they produce in the US and they sell to local consumers, they don't need to pay the tariff, that higher price is something they can pocket. Okay, so domestic producers of the industry that is subject to a tariff are typically happy with tariffs. And in fact, so happy, they often pay for them. They lobby for them, and I'll get to that. Not all producers are happy. For instance, in the car industry, when we have tariffs applying to goods related to the car industry, they might apply to finished cars, but they might apply to engines, they might apply to tires, other car parts. If I'm a producer, but I'm buying inputs, parts from abroad, and I'm subject to tariffs, that's just increasing my costs. So it's not just us consumers being hurt. Some producers are not going to like that. Okay, so parenthesis, but Trump tariffs back and forth. We're going to have tariffs on Canada. Automakers go up in arms, and now they're carved out. Okay, that's the latest as of yesterday, I think. So why in part is this? Because they're hurt. It's not just consumers. We worry about it in terms of inflation. Some producers are worried about tariffs. What is the net effect is generally ambiguous. You might, it's tempting to say tariffs are always bad, but it's not true. That is, if a country is trading with other countries and the other countries are not setting tariffs on you, and you decide to set a tariff, if you set it at the right level, it could actually be a plus for an economy. Net income, net GDP, real income might actually go up if you nail it, if you get the right level. Having said that, if foreign countries retaliate, that is, we set tariffs on them and they set tariffs on us, it's really hard to generate scenarios where that is a good thing. We end up in a situation where we're hurting each other and nobody's gaining from that. Okay, and to some people, that's a rationale for why institutions like the WTO emerged, to try to kind of calm things down, create mechanisms for countries not to have this incentive to put tariffs on each other, realizing that these tariff wars were bad for everybody. With Smoot-Hawley, Great Depression, tariff wars in mind, that was sort of the intellectual fuel into kind of trying to deal with it. Yes?
Can I just ask you a clarifying question?
Yes.
I mean, I think that when you said tariffs can sometimes be good.
Yes.
If absent retaliation, but that is only in the case where your tariffs are actually going to drive down the price.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. It depends on the tax incidence.
I mean, if you were a small country,
Yes.
it would be bad.
Yeah, I'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
So it's ambiguous, but it is going to be tightly connected to what I mentioned before, who pays the tariff.
Yeah.
If I pay the tariff, then that's not a good idea. Okay, if I fully pay the tariff, it's never going to be a good idea. If I manage to get them to pay a little bit of the tariff, there's always going to be a sufficiently small tariff that is going to be good. Okay, that's what my point about you really need to nail it. You can't go to you cannot set it too high. So that's one. The other thing that I added this morning is that maybe it's a good thing, but you better have a very clear plan of what you're going to do. You can't just sort of on Monday have tariffs, on Tuesday you don't. On Wednesday have tariffs. That is really bad. Okay, uncertainty is bad for investment. Not even these guys like uncertainty. Okay, people want to know what they need to do. What are the determinants of the level of tariffs? Coming to Oliver's point. Okay, so first the economics. Okay, so if we think about in economics we often invoke this fictional people, like the Walrasian auctioneer that magically sets prices to clear markets, or the benevolent social planner, which is this all-good policymaker with an infinite horizon that tries to make decisions that maximize economic welfare. If this person existed and made choices on our behalf, it would set tariffs to the level that maximizes welfare, and the optimal tariff would be one that would depend on incidence, on who pays the tariff. As an Oliver anticipated, if in a situation in which foreign producers or foreigners are unwilling to lower the price of what they sell to us when we put tariffs, the optimal tariff would be 0. But if we manage to lower the price of what we buy from the rest of the world through a tariff, because the foreigners really want to sell to us, so they're willing to lower the price to maintain those sales into the US, then in principle a tariff, by generating revenue and a lower price of imports, can increase welfare. Okay, but the issue is how high you want that tariff to be. And again, the retaliation point is very important. You need to make sure that those other countries are not going to retaliate.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt again.
Yes.
Not world welfare, but
No, yeah, but okay, he's not that
we
benevolent.
don't care about
A benevolent, patriotic, chauvinistic social planner.
Yes, it's a particular.
And just to be clear, if you get the other country to lower their prices and then they pay the tariff, the consumer doesn't notice the difference.
No, okay, fair enough. I mean, in this benevolent social planner, if you're a consumer, you're not going to feel it's all that benevolent because you're still going to be hurt. The point here is that your loss in real income is more than compensated, can be more than compensated by the gain of real income of those that benefit from the tariff. Now that begs the question of how to define social welfare. Okay, that's for another Friday. That's a whole sort of issue of...
It's revenue to the state, not to the
Correct,
consumer. Yeah.
correct. So that's, happy to talk more about that. Exactly, how do we think about social welfare? And you might ask, is this the right way to think about it or not? Okay, that's a good question. Is this what we see in reality? I am trying to be nonpartisan, but I'm having a hard time mapping Trump to this individual. So we typically think that politicians have other things in mind. That's true for any politician. And there are good reasons why, even in a democracy, well-functioning democracy, you might anticipate that some groups in society, some industries in society, might be in a particular good position to dictate what policies the government's going to be putting in place in ways that are good for them. Okay, so we have a democracy, but we have elections, and we know elections by votes. Not directly, but if you have lots of money, you have fancier campaigns, you can go to more places, that ends up giving you more votes. So politicians, if they care about being elected, and they might care about being elected because they want to do good. I'm not saying they're bad people, but they want to be elected, they're going to be responsive to lobbying. And that's going to generate higher rates of protection in sectors that are particularly good at lobbying. What is good at lobbying? We could get into deeper aspects of what makes a sector particularly good at lobbying, but there's ample evidence for that. One of our colleagues at Harvard, Elhanan Helpman, has written extensively about political economy forces as being important for tariffs. So that tells you that often tariffs might deviate from the social welfare maximizing ones through the political process. National security is another reason why you might see protection in some sectors. That's basically, a charitable interpretation of policies that use tariffs for national security reasons, is that perhaps economists have a too narrow view of what's social welfare. It's not just about real income, we care about national security. So if you care about national security, maybe you want to put tariffs on goods that you think are dangerous, or you might put export restrictions, okay, rather than import restrictions. You might want to have export restrictions on some goods. Never a good idea to send nuclear warheads to North Korea, for instance. Obviously, that's not something you want to do. Okay, so that's definitely economies of knowledge, national security as a consideration. How does the WTO constrain tariff choices? In principle, through the articles that are the foundation of the WTO. The WTO is an institution that emerges from the GATT, which is an agreement that was signed after World War II. And the key principles that sort of made this seemingly work are the concepts of reciprocity and MFN, or most favored nation clause. Reciprocity is the idea that if I lower tariffs vis-a-vis a country, the other country is going to reduce their tariffs accordingly. Or more importantly, if I deviate from the agreement and I increase my tariffs vis-a-vis another countries, that automatically allows the foreign country to also raise their tariffs. So, because it's automatic, I always realize that if I raise my tariffs, they're going to raise their tariffs, they're going to retaliate, so I'm not going to want to do it, because I told you before, that's typically not a good idea. So it's sort of automatically triggering the retaliation that we know is going to give countries some pause. MFN is a little bit more subtle how to think about it, but it's the idea that I cannot discriminate. I cannot have different tariffs on some countries versus others. And that when you're trying to coordinate across many, many countries, that turns out to be a very, very helpful clause to have. Now you might start wondering, what is this guy talking about? I mean, we had free trade with Canada and Mexico, and we had positive tariffs on other countries. That's clear violation of MFN. Yes, there's exceptions in the WTO, articles of the WTO, I think it's Article 23, that says there's one exception to the MFN rule, which is if you want to have a free trade agreement with a subset of countries, you can do that. But it has to be a free trade agreement. You cannot say 8% tariff on some people and 5% on these other guys. It has to be 0. Okay, and that's what's behind NAFTA, the European Community, Mercosur, Asian FTA, and all this stuff. These are agreements that went to free trade, or they had a plan to go to free trade. You see this, and you see what's happening, and you're like, what's happening? So how does the WTO constrain tariff choices? In practice, it doesn't. Okay, this was an implicit agreement. Like, let's all do this. Okay, let's all do this. But last I checked, the WTO doesn't have cannons, doesn't have guns. There's no enforcement power. Okay, it doesn't have a military. So this is all there was a reputation that was built. Countries built a reputation for abiding by these rules. And it worked while people trusted it. But the moment that countries started dismissing it or ignoring it, it became really pretty useless. Okay, so you might say, well, if I deviated, we can get more into this about when Bush put some steel tariffs at some point in time that triggered retaliation, legal processes, and eventually sort of those tariffs were taken out. Okay, because there were some rulings, and the U.S. decided to abide by those rulings. But why would Trump, if the WTO says what you're doing is wrong and you need to pay this or you suffer these consequences, Trump's going to say, so what? What are you guys going to do to me? That has no power, practical, effective power. Okay? All right, so with all that in mind, let's think now more narrowly about Trump. So first, tariffs, which I plotted before here. Okay, this is what actually happened in 2018 and 2019. Okay, increases in tariffs in many sectors. Let's first think about how he sold them. Okay, so he was very explicit about it. In the first campaign, he was very explicit about what he wanted to do. I think most people thought he's not going to go through with that, and he did. But the so-called America First trade policy, not America First trade policy, was based on what? One, defending our national sovereignty over trade policy. That's basically saying, forget about the WTO. Essentially, that's one way to read it. These guys are not going to tell us what to do. Strictly enforce U.S. trade laws, so that has to do with picking on China. And, I'll be the first one to say, Trump completely ignored the WTO. We could talk a lot about how China did not abide by certain rules of the WTO. I'll be the first one to admit that. Okay, especially with regard to intellectual property and things like that. Okay, so that's part of it. Like the WTO is not enforcing IPR protection. We're going to come and do it this way. We're going to use leverage to open foreign markets. Leverage, muscle. And we're going to negotiate new and better trade deals. So he said he was going to renegotiate NAFTA, and he did. USMCA followed from that. So that's what he was selling. What was really the motivation for this? Okay, this is how you sell stuff, and then we can debate about what was he after. Okay, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, and let's see, this is all you want to win an election, but what was the intellectual thinking behind it? Was it the tax incident? That is the idea that we're big in world markets and we can make the foreigners pay the tariff? I don't think that's what he thought. The evidence is very clear. This happened. There's a lot of empirical work that show that the US paid the tariff. Prices that foreigners collected in selling to the US did not move. That means we paid 100% of the tariff. All empirical analysis that I've seen are consistent with this. So if it was tax incidents, which I doubt, that was wrong. Was it lobbying? Not so clear. I don't really think that it had much to do with particular sectors seeking protection in some sectors. I think producers were generally unhappy about it. So what was it? I think it was popular demand for protection. This was a Republican president, but a populist one that really tried to speak to the people and give them what they wanted. And it is absolutely the case that despite everything we tell people in the classroom about how good trade is and how you should fight protection, there's a general sentiment among the population that maybe trade is not as great as we economists paint it to be, that there's lots of hidden costs to it, and that we should not be embracing free trade the way that we did. And I think catering to that demand, he went ahead and became the tariff man. Okay? Now you might ask the question of why is it? How did we get it wrong? How did economists get it wrong? If everybody, typically if everybody believes something, typically they are right. And the people that are in the minority are wrong. So I think a lot of that has to do with the question that this gentleman here asked before, which is that our case for free trade or lower protection is one that is always coupled with the idea that, yes, trade can generate distributional effects, even disruptive effects. When you open up to trade, some sectors might be hurt a lot, but we know that in principle, the gains from reducing tariffs are higher than the losses. So in principle, there should be mechanisms to compensate those that are worse off, provide them subsidies, unemployment insurance, ways to make them as well off as they were before. But that is not the type of policies that we saw in the 2000s during this big China shock, which disrupted US manufacturing. There's a lot of empirical studies that have shown that areas in the US that were most affected by Chinese competition, they saw very dramatic declines in employment, very dramatic increases in disability insurance take-up, which is the most inefficient way you can think about compensating losers, massive increases in drug use, divorce rates, very bad socioeconomic outcomes, okay? Because areas were devastated by the shock. And if you're living in those areas, you're not going to feel too good about trade, okay? And maybe you don't live in those areas, but you have a cousin that lives in those areas, or you have an uncle that lives in those areas. So it is well established that economic agents often put a very high weight on losses and less so on gains. The gains from trade are a bit more subtle. Yeah, lower consumer prices. You folks are all well educated. You understand that when you go to the grocery store or you go to Target or one of the stores, you're buying stuff from China that is much cheaper than it would be if it had been produced in the US. But it takes some sophistication in the face of inflation, for instance, to notice that if you've always paid $40, $50 for jeans, you might say, well, I'm not getting lower prices for this stuff. I've always paid the same. What are there lower prices? Obviously, there are lower prices because inflation's going up because of other reasons. But it takes some minimum sophistication to figure out how large the gains from trade are. The losses are very visible. We all know someone who lost a job because the factory closed down. So I think it's not shocking that there would be popular demand for protection. Okay, and I think I believe, and there's some work that shows that that was really what was behind the first round of tariffs. What about Trump 2? Okay, so let me first tell you about the announced policies. I can go quick because they keep changing. But if you look at the electoral campaigns, he was saying minimum 10% tariffs on all goods. Okay, Yes.
All goods from all countries?
From all countries, yes. That was what was announced, that was his plan. You might say, oh my God, this is huge. It is huge if you look at the last 20 years. But again, you can go back in time to the 1950s and 60s. There were higher tariff rates, even higher in the 20s and 30s. So it's not unprecedented, but obviously it is very different from what we've seen in recent years. Imposing higher tariffs on particular imports, 100% tariffs on cars produced outside the US. Okay, so seemingly with the idea of bringing car production into the US. But the automaker, I mean, we can talk much more about that, but the auto industry is a very complex one. And we've seen just based on the recent Canada tariffs that they really don't want this. Okay, they were really going and talking to the president right away to kind of carve out the car sector from the most recent announcements. Minimum 60% tariffs on China's goods and phase out Chinese imports, that is preventing more and more imports of essential goods, semiconductors and things like that over 4 years. So basically the panorama is we're going to be putting massive tariffs on China, and for some goods we're just going to stop importing from China altogether. And then this so-called Trump Reciprocal Trade Act, which is to impose reciprocal tariffs on countries that levy tariffs on the US goods. That is something he actually mentioned in the State of the Union if you watched it the other day, which is any asymmetry. If there's a country that sets a higher tariffs on the US than we set on them, he's going to equalize those rates. Okay, so he seems very much set.
Wasn't he claiming that value-added taxes were like a tariff because you have to pay them to get those goods, and that he would impose tariffs based on that, which seems to me...
I mean, that's more about the rationale of that, and we're happy to talk more about it. I'm almost done, so let me complete, but I can come back to this. I have my own views about whether this is reasonable or not, or what he has in mind. So what is the real motivation? Okay, so tax incidents, I guess I doubt it. I mean, they've seen the studies, so they cannot possibly think that the U.S. is going to, that the foreigners are going to pay a big percentage of the tariffs. There's some subtleties here, actually. I mean, there's some economists, reasonable economists that would tell you when you move to fairly isolated tariffs to much higher tariffs, exchange rates, the dollar might start moving in ways, like appreciating, in ways that will lower import prices, that acts like a lower import prices. But I don't know if the US dollar is going to appreciate. I mean, if you looked at the last couple of days, the US dollar has been depreciating quite significantly, so which is going to make imports even more expensive. Okay? So it is really far from obvious that that's behind it. Political economy lobbying, I doubt it. I mean, if anything, car example, they just went straight to him and said, please don't do this. Okay, we have a very integrated global value chain with Canada and Mexico. If we start paying 28% or 25% tariffs, that's going to destroy us. Popular demand for protection, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure anymore. I think people are smart enough to realize that in the face of recent inflationary forces, that this is going to jack up prices even more. And I don't think, I mean, certainly people in this area of the U.S., I think, don't want this. But I'm not sold that this is what people are generally want. What is the most charitable interpretation I could think about is national security. Okay, so he is deeply concerned about national security. He's worried about in the Canada tariffs. I mean, maybe he's worried about the Arctic. There's not enough military, Canadian military people in the Arctic. He's trying really to push them to do that. They're not listening, and the only way he has to making them do that is by threatening to have tariffs or something like that. Maybe, or with China, it has to do with semiconductors and things like that. There might be some people telling him that, and that might be part of the story. More likely, and that's my last comment, is I think truly he's, as in the first round of tariffs, he's approaching this as a businessman, as an aggressive businessman. He's trying to get good deals for the U.S. He sees these imbalances in how much U.S. companies pay in tariffs in other countries versus the U.S. He thinks that we are paying too many tariffs and we should be lowering them and showing a strong hand. Why he's doing that with Canada and Mexico is a mystery because we have a free trade agreement with them. But with other countries, that seems to be what he has in mind. And I personally think that's very dangerous. It's wrong and it's dangerous. I think it's wrong for a variety of reasons, but perhaps the more important one is that global international negotiations are very different from business negotiations. You know, if you're trying to sign a deal to buy a house, you can be or buy a car in the US, can be very, very aggressive. And you're probably not going to deal with that person again in another few years. Or you're going to sign a deal and a contract and it's going to be enforced and then that'll be it. But in international negotiations, this is a repeated situation where we're building a reputation and you can't just blow up, come in all blazing, with guns blazing and, you know, making people kneel down and beg for things, because that's going to come back to have a reputational cost. So I think maybe he's approaching it as a businessman, but I think that is dangerous, and it's likely to kind of put the U.S. Diplomatic relationships with other countries in real danger. That's what I'm most concerned about, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just ask?
Yes.
You know, you mentioned that you thought Trump might be saying, well, why are we paying tariffs to other countries? We should have our own tariffs. But I don't think that's what he's been saying at all. I mean, what he's really been talking about is our trade deficits, which I think reflects just a fundamental misunderstanding on his part about how international trade works. And he seems to think that trade deficits means that we're losing money and that tariffs are going to, you know, a reason to, you know, that's a reason to impose tariffs. Just, you know, is there any connection there at all that makes any sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I haven't talked about deficits. I mean, I would say it's even worse in the sense that there's been a lot of focus on bilateral deficits, U.S. China. That is, any economist would tell you that's the wrong way to think about it. Okay? You want to think about, if anything, you might worry about a very large deficit. But deficits, it's not really clear how tariffs are going to interact with that. A deficit, a trade deficit, you can see it as a difference between exports and imports, but it's also a difference between saving and investment. So it tells you that there's some dynamic aspects of it that are driving this. Part of the reason why the U.S. runs such a large trade imbalance is because lots and lots of foreign individuals want to invest in the U.S. They have, you know, think about Asia, growing Asia, lots of savings, and you know, they view the U.S. economy, partly because of their dynamism, innovation, and all this stuff, or enforcement of property rights as a good place to park your wealth. So if lots of people want to invest in the U.S., you're going to have investment that far exceeds savings, local savings, and that's going to generate a deficit. That has nothing to do with tariffs. Now, obviously, if we went to what we call autarky, we completely closed our economy to the rest of the world, then that would have an effect on the deficit, right? Because you're willing to kind of invest in the U.S. knowing that you can bring stuff back from there at some point in time. You can get your money back. But it's really hard to kind of have capital flows if there's no trade flows at all. Okay, but I don't think that's. I don't think there's a tight connection. I mean, there is a connection in the sense of, which goes back to something that I said in passing, which is in the Chinese case, part of the reason they had achieved such a high growth of exports is through some subsidies, currency manipulation that helped them in that. And it's questionable whether that was in accordance with WTO rules or so on. But the way to do that is just to kind of try to sign agreements to try to get them to not to do that, rather than just to blow up the whole system, which seems to be the approach here.
What you said under number 7 in terms of the motivation under Trump 1 was interesting, because you said it, but why? Disruptive effect of increased trade with China. But in actuality, that increased trade was a result of U.S. corporations offshoring jobs for lower production costs.
Yes.
But that's something I'll bring up with the Harvard Business School people in terms of social responsibility.
That's a different topic. I thought you were, okay, so we can talk about whether that is something that this company should have done, but I thought how I first interpreted your question is more related to work that I've actually done, which I've argued very much, this so-called China shock, which seems to, many economists interpret that as a shock that really hurt US producers because there's a bunch of consumer goods that were produced in the US and now we're importing from China. So that was increased what we call import competition. But the China shock, if you look at trade flows, about 2/3 of trade flows are not consumer goods, the type of stuff we buy in Target and things like that. The 2/3 of trade flows are inputs, car parts, semiconductors, things that you're not going to find in Target necessarily. So lots of US companies actually benefited a lot from the China shock.
Right.
For them, the China shock was a reduction in cost, which allowed them to make higher profits, but if you look at the data, it also allowed them to expand. Okay, so Apple generated lots of work in China, but also lots of work in the US, in innovation, design, and the stores and things like that. So there's a subset of US companies that benefited a lot from the China shock in ways that were not bad for the US economy. Okay, the counterfactual where they wouldn't have been allowed to do that is a little bit less clear. Having said that, when you put all that together, I'll be the first one to admit that the net effect of the China shock was a reduction in US manufacturing. Yes, it generated some jobs for some firms that were able to leverage this China shock, but for many other ones, this was devastating. Okay, and it is indeed the case that probably we should have had policies that would have better dealt with that situation, either through maybe more progressive tax systems. US tax progressivity has gone down dramatically in the last 40 years, in a period in which we've had a series of shocks, the China shock, automation, skill bias, technical change, that really increased inequality. Okay,
I hadn't thought about the second side. You have to break it down into two sections in terms of the benefit for the apples.
exactly, there's winners and losers in that, but I think there were lots of losers, and this country could have benefited from the type of policies that other countries have used, like active labor market policies that would have allowed people to kind of land on their feet as a result of the shocks, and it didn't happen, and that made a lot of people discontent. So, I mean, it's very tempting to blame everything on individuals. We just happen to elect this Trump guy, but it's not as simple. Okay? This person was elected for a reason. There's some underlying forces, and it's not clear they're going to go away.
One of the things that Trump did was he talked about Michigan and Ohio and all the jobs that had lost,
Yes.
and some of them to Canada. So he's saying he wants the Canadian companies to put those jobs back in America, which would be devastating for Canada. And so I think he's maybe doing it for political purposes, to keep those states.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think that is maybe part of it. Let me suggest an alternative, which is, the Canadian economy has had a rough patch in the last few years. That's why, in part, why Trudeau is basically cooked. I don't think. I think he understands that, like, making the recession in Canada even stronger is probably not good for the U.S. Unless you have some sort of dreams of expanding the borders of the U.S., and in that case, you're reducing the price you would need to pay with the hopes that they're going to beg for being the 51st state or something like that. That is totally far-fetched. And I mean, you talk to any Canadians, I don't think they have much desire to do that. But that might be part of the story.
And also, didn't Trump lower the import tax so that there used to be like $800 you could bring in without paying an import tax, and now it's on everything.
On everything, meaning
Customs.
that he got rid of the
$800
800. You mean that?
Yeah.
Well, you could buy things from China as long as they were under $800.
I see. Yeah, I mean they've been trying to crack on this sort of e-commerce type of thing, which was a way to kind of bypass. And I think that's, I think that's not a bad idea. Okay, if you have a set of rules, it should apply broadly. I don't have any problems with that. But it could be the case also that Trump and his advisors, they have a bit of a traditional view of what tariffs do. Okay, so again, I mentioned that in principle, if cars were 100% produced in a country, and you want to increase car production in the U.S., you're going to want to have a tariff. A tariff is going to help you do that, because these producers are going to be more protected. Even if their costs a little bit higher, they can outcompete foreigners. So that should increase the size of that sector. But that is a very old-fashioned way to think about the auto industry. The auto industry, cars are produced in like hundreds of locations. You have assembly plants, but they're using things that are coming from all over the globe. And it's really hard to reorganize that global value chain very quickly. So you could have dreams of moving auto production into the US, but if you need parts that are coming from China or Vietnam or other places where you have all these other tariffs, or there's like back and forth between the US and Canada in the production of a car, that is not going to be something you can immediately move. And it could be very costly to try to do that. And I'm not sure how much they realize that until the car producers picked up the phone and said, what are you guys saying in the State of the Union that we like this? We hate this stuff. Stop saying that. And that led to the carve-outs, I think, yesterday. Yesterday, right? I mean, this is really happening in real time. Yes. Yes.
When Canada and the U.S. did the free trade agreement, the precursor to NAFTA, Canada was given in the agreement, as part of the agreement, put on a value-added tax, which is now 5% nationally, but there's some provincial ones. And the U.S. did not. And there have been a lot of people who've been advocating for value-added tax. And clearly, part of what's going on in the tariffs is a reaction to the value-added tax. And it's a really bad way to have a value-added tax. I'm just wondering what you think about the prospects for value-added tax, or what may happen.
I don't have strong either views or sort of deep expertise on this. I think it is true that we're sort of used to the sales tax as sort of a natural thing to have, but it is true that most countries in the world operate very differently via value-added tax. I think on economic grounds, this probably makes much more sense, because you're taxing exactly what you want to be taxing, which is a particular transaction, what the seller is doing relative to what he had bought from other agents. So that seems a better way to approach it. But the implementation of a value-added tax is complicated. It generates all sorts of issues in terms of compliance and all this stuff. So I honestly don't have a very strong view on whether the U.S. should move to a value-added tax or not, and how that would interface with tariffs. I mean, I've heard this complaints and things like that, but I don't know how first order they are in motivating the use of tariffs.
Canada went through about a 4-year period of stagflation when they introduced the goods and services tax. Difficult to get at.
Yeah, I don't know whether that was sort of causally related or not, right? I mean, what else was happening, and do we really know that that was the cause of that? I'm less sure about that. But in principle, I mean, if you adjust the levels in such, I mean, I don't see why that per se would create a recession if you do it carefully. But yeah, I mean, there's, if we now have policies in place and we have a recession in the next 2 years, it might be tempting to say, well, it's this policy that generated the recession. But obviously, there's all the other stuff that's happening that might have been the underlying cause of that.
Are economists taking into account the threat of climate change on the planet in terms of we need to reduce consumption, we need possibly to reduce populations? How does all of that work in? Because it's a threat to survival of our civilization. I mean, outside of Putin and Trump is the other big threats.
Sure. I mean, the short answer is yes, of course. I mean, we have a whole field of environmental economics, which is precisely trying to think about this. What's the effect of the economy on climate change? What are the right policies to fight it? In terms of the connections to international trade, you might know there are countries or blocs like the European Union that has tried to kind of put in place trade taxes that try to kind of increase or decrease the ability to import stuff from dirty places or using dirty techniques, right? So that's part of it. Having said that, the problem of climate change is a global problem,
Yes.
and global problems typically require global solutions, international agreements, and things like that. And I'm personally very pessimistic that this is going to be happening anytime soon in the current geopolitical environment, right? So clearly, it was a harder thing to tackle than trade. That's why WTO worked for so long, and Kyoto Protocol and like Paris Agreement and all this stuff is not really gone very far. I'm not so sure. I mean, the only thing that can save us is technical change. That's what allows me to sleep at night. That we'll figure out a way to do things even without policies. But it is obviously a problem.
So I guess we need really major disasters to get the attention of the planet to doing something.
I mean, well, we have them already, right? I mean, there's no lack of evidence.
We need more.
No, I mean, we can talk a lot about that. I mean, it's sort of, there's issues of horizons too, right? Which is, if you're a politician, you have a certain horizon. And when somebody tells you, if you don't do that, in a year you're going to have a recession, they're going to kick you out of office, you go and do it and you start spending on this and that. If they tell you in 200 years your house will be flooded, you say whatever. Let the next one deal with it.
Probably more like 20 now.
Sure, even 20. I mean, in a political life, that's like 200 years, right? So that's part of the problem. But we can just speak about it, speak up about it. That's all we can do.
Well, one of the things that Trump kept saying in terms of imposing tariffs was that Canada and Mexico was that they had to decrease the flow of fentanyl and the illegal border crossings. Yes. What was that all about in terms of economics, or was that just political?
It was a lot.
No, it's not political. It's I don't think. Look, I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't know how large the flows are to justify a 25% tariff. Okay. But certainly, if there are a lot of drugs coming in through a border because some country is not enforcing, doesn't have enough enforcement, that seems reasonable to try to stop that.
So
I think it's unreasonable to use tariffs to do that.
The tariff doesn't stop it. The tariff is putting pressure on the country to stop it.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's the idea. And with immigration is similar. And I cannot be objective on this because I'm an immigrant. I realize it's hard to be objective, but I think I'm objective enough to, accept the notion that illegal immigration is something that is not necessarily good. That you want to bring immigrants. I personally think this country could use another 100 million immigrants, and that would make us much better off generally. But there has to be a way to kind of bring them in through the legal system. And if we have lots of people, undocumented people crossing the border, that poses a problem. I think I'll be the first one to admit that. But tariff threats is probably the wrong way to do it. There's got to be other things you can invoke, because it's not just threats. It's like you're putting them in place and like you're giving a deadline, and then the deadline comes like, I'll give you another month. I mean, this is sort of making everybody completely lost. It creates a lot of uncertainty. Your pensions are 10% down. Nobody likes this stuff.
I would point out 5% of fentanyl comes across the border from Canada, I think, so it's very low.
Yeah.
And
That's not what's
Yeah.
happening with Canada.
yeah, and then I was in Quebec and I met someone who's a border patrol person from Canada, and they said 50% of the people are coming to Canada, and they're Asian, and then 50% of people are going to the United States and they're Indian, and it's a wash.
I just want to ask back to tariffs. I've read one criticism of tariffs is that they basically allow domestic manufacturers to charge the same price that, that the tariff inflated price from the foreign goods for lower quality goods, basically. Do you see that as being the typical response, is that you end up buying more expensive goods, but they actually are lower quality than what you had before the tariffs?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the evidence as to whether you end up producing lower quality, or you end up, paying workers that are less productive. But certainly it gives you a cushion, right? So one of the benefits of trade is just reversing the argument, is it keeps you on your toes. It makes you improve your techniques to keep up with competition. Okay, if the foreigners threatening to, you're gonna start to find even more efficient ways to produce, perhaps. Once you have protection, that is reduced, and it might allow you to pay higher salaries, higher wages, which in some cases might be good for workers, but in some cases might lead to waste or lower productivity. Okay, or in some cases might be, I'm just sort of, I can produce lower quality stuff because domestic consumers don't have cheap alternatives. So
better.
either way, it's something that might hurt consumers. Either you pay higher prices or get lower quality. That is not going to be good. Yes.
So you mentioned that the value of the dollar is dropping. Is that a reflection of this uncertainty with the tariffs, or are there other things going on?
Oof. No.
In
Time
one-
is up.
In 1 minute. In 1 minute, please.
I think it is really a challenge to explain exchange rates. It is one of the areas where I think it's a particularly hard to weigh on, and particularly because we've seen tariff announcements and the dollar's been going in all directions. Initially, when we talked about the Canada-Mexico stuff, the dollar appreciated a lot relative to the Canadian dollar. Okay? The last set of announcements has moved the other way around. So why is this happening? It's hard to tell, but I think there is a sense that this president might not exactly know what he's doing. In the sense that, no, I mean in a sense that there is now a positive probability that the U.S. will go down a path that will severely impact the prosperity of the country, and in which case you would expect that people are going to start pulling their wealth out of the country, and maybe that's what we're seeing. I mean, but I don't know whether. I mean, it's really hard to explain these things, but that's probably what generated the. But you guys have phones. Maybe now the dollar is like 20% up. Exchange rates move a lot. Okay,
They're scared we're going to crypto.
There,
What
yeah.
is the
That's
crypto?
not. Yeah, don't ask me about crypto. The time is up was a joke. Okay.
No, we know.
No.
I did have a question. In your presentation, several times you use the term that people want protection. What do they want protection from? The people, the mass.
From Chinese competition, mostly.
So
There's a sense that
why do we need protection from that?
because it devastated my town, devastated my uncle's town. I mean, that's.
But it didn't do mine.
Huh?
Well-
Oh, you don't. But
So I
you're not the majority.
know.
You don't need to be reminded of that. I know, but this is of course not everybody. But there's big chunks of the U.S. that you should invite Gordon Hanson. Who's at the Kennedy School, who's done a lot of pioneer work on that. I can show you all the maps of like all the areas that were affected.
Yeah.
There's lots of them. Okay, so it adds up. It adds up.
This was great.
Not too uplifting though.
Well,
A realist.
Maybe
Thank
we
you.
can have a lecture on crypto, just explain.
I don't know if my brain can absorb that right now. Maybe in a while. But I want to thank you so much for coming out today because I learned a lot from your
Yeah, me too,
presentation.
yeah.
And as I want to remind everyone, this will be available on LexMedia. So if you want to recommend it to your friends,
and acquaintances to watch. And people do go and watch those sometimes, so I appreciate that. I want to thank Paul for coming. I want to thank all of you for coming, LexMedia for being here to record it. And I want to just make an announcement that on April 4th, which is our first Friday forum in April, is going to be on a totally different topic, accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Well, there's new law has been passed that's just gone into effect. So there's that. And it will be presented by Charles Hornick from the Lexington Housing Partnership, Tim O'Reilly from a builder of backyard ADUs, Jennifer Conroy from Cambridge Savings Bank who financed these things, Olivia Lawler and Bruce Dempsey from the town of Lexington who do the permits, and from Todd Berger who's an ADU owner. So that should be a very interesting thing because there's a lot of confusion about what you have to do to get an ADU. So put that on your calendars for April.
They can
And
go
with
with
that,
your
there's
backyard
some more
chicken.
refreshments
Thank you.
out there.
They can go with your
Thank you.
backyard
Oh,
chicken.
thank you.